Welcome back to People Analytics. I'm your host, Lindsay Patton. Today's guest is Katie MacDonald, who works with Miles For Migraine. Welcome, Katie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being a guest on the show. Could you tell me a little bit about Miles For Migraine and your role in it?
Sure. So I am the Director of Operations for Miles For Migraine. This is a nonprofit that was founded in 2008 by a nurse out in San Francisco named Eileen Jones. Eileen went to an advocacy event in Washington, D.C. called Headache on the Hill. And when she was talking to her members of Congress about advocacy for migraine and headache disease, they suggested to her that really the only way to drive change is to do it at the community level and to take on a project. And so she went home to San Francisco and started a walk-run event as a fundraiser for migraine disease. And for several years, the organization just existed in San Francisco with that one event. But fast forward to 2021, and we are now in 24 cities around the United States. We put on over 50 events a year. We've expanded from just being the walk-run events. We also do educational events. We have programming for parents and teens specifically who are living with migraine and headache disease. All kinds of different offerings, especially in the virtual world these days with support groups and mindfulness options. And essentially, we're an organization that exists to raise awareness about migraine and headache disease, combat the stigma that surrounds these diseases, and just provide community, provide an opportunity for people to get together with like-minded folks. The one thing that's unique about Miles For Migraine is that with all of our walk-run events, we use these as fundraising opportunities. So all of the funds that get raised from our walk-run events are used specifically to support migraine and headache disease research and to support fellows, which are doctors who are in a year of specialty training for headache medicine. Our fundraising supports their programming as well.
And this is a cause that's near and dear to your heart, too.
It is. Yeah, I am a person who lives with chronic migraine. And in fact, I get attacks every day. Migraine has, as with many people, had a big impact on my life. I was in the corporate world for a long time, but about 6 years ago, had to leave due to the impact that migraine was having on my health and kind of my ability to manage. So I've, kind of had that experience of transitioning out of the so to speak, regular workforce. Thankfully, I found a new place for myself and kind of reestablished myself as a person with chronic migraine and found a way to continue to be productive in society.
And that's the reason why I'm so happy that you're on, because, as someone who also lives with migraine, and you never know what the day will bring.
Exactly.
I think it's something, awareness in the HR world specifically is so important, because I think a lot of us try to hide it because headache and migraine are often, used interchangeably, and that's not the case. So could you clarify what migraine is?
Absolutely. Yeah. So migraine it's a neurological disease, and it is complicated in that there are no specific tests that can be given to somebody to confirm that they have migraine. Instead, migraine is diagnosed by symptoms, so the different symptoms that somebody experiences. And while many people think of migraine as, sounds like it's just a bad headache, in fact, there is usually a lot more that goes on. People with migraine may or may not have head pain with their attacks. They also have a lot of sensory issues, sensitivity to lights and sounds and smells, migraine often impacts people cognitively. People get what's described as brain fog, an inability to concentrate. It can impact your GI system. It's really, it's really a full body disease. It's not what is often thought of as just a bad headache. And headache is often a part of migraine. And there are also several diseases that kind of fall under the umbrella of migraine and headache disease that are primary headache disorders, like new daily persistent headache or cluster headache attacks, which are also not really headaches. But headache is really just a symptom of migraine. It is not the full disease.
Yeah, and it's great that you bring that up, because one of the things that I struggle with the disease is aphasia, which is just losing your words.
Yeah.
And as a communicator, as a writer, it really impacts me, because I know the word, but my brain isn't, in its filing system, isn't able to bring it to the forefront. So I'm glad that you explained that it's so much than just head pain.
Exactly.
And I feel like, a lot of people who have mental illness challenges can kind of relate too, because, when we're down, we're down. And, similarly, if you have a bad mental health day, it's very hard to get out of bed. It's hard to function. So what would you like HR leaders to know about employees with migraine or living? What's the best way to phrase it?
Yeah, it's, there's so much to know. I think a couple of key things are that migraine impacts so many people. 1 in 4 households in the US has somebody living with migraine disease. It's actually the second most disabling condition, according to the World Health Organization in the United States. So it's highly, highly prevalent. But from an HR person's perspective, you have many employees who are living with migraine and are fearful to say anything about it. Because while people with migraine are extremely capable, and in fact, often hyper capable, what happens is, because the attacks are so unpredictable, these are people who may, need to leave work early. They may be calling out of work, and people often misunderstand and stigmatize them and say, you just have a headache. Can't you just take some Tylenol? And you're really messing me up by not showing up to work today. You're impacting your team and all this stuff. And that causes people with migraine to kind of withdraw and not want to tell people that that's what they have. So from an HR perspective, my number one thing would be to have some educational programs so that people do start to better understand migraine and other invisible illnesses and diseases that your employees are living with. And that would help them understand or show that perhaps your organization is interested in being supportive for these types of diseases.
I wanted to go back to your work experience and talk about, what that was like living with as a person with migraine, and how you tried to work it out with your employer during that time.
Yeah, I have a story that's probably not that much different from several other people who live with migraine. I, kind of went through several years of the frequency and severity of my migraine attacks increasing. And I actually switched employers at one point, thinking maybe it's the stress of, my current job that's really causing this. But, I had multiple inpatient stays for treatment of migraine, and I'd had a couple of disability leaves, short-term disability. And I finally got to the point with my last employer where I had another inpatient stay, and I just was at the point where I could barely manage. It was taking everything I had to get myself to show up at work every day and be present for my employees. I was often having to leave early because of bad attacks. And I, constantly felt guilty. I was worried I was running out of PTO. I just didn't have enough time to be taking all this time off. And, one of the things that happened to me is kind of earlier on in the process, I went to HR with a concern about how much PTO I was using to go to doctor's appointments and take time off. And I was worried, what do I do if I run out? And the person I dealt with they just said, you would run out. You'd have to figure it out. And I wish that person had told me about FMLA. That's a right. It was a larger organization. I definitely had access to that. But at that point in my understanding of the disease, I didn't realize that was a right I had. And so ultimately, I ended up needing to take a long-term disability from the last employer. And when it got to be time to consider coming back to work, I asked about some accommodations, like being able to work part-time or being able to work remotely. And this was all pre-COVID, of course. And they didn't feel like that was the role that I was in. They felt like needed to be full-time in person. And so, I don't have negative things to say about them. We kind of decided to part ways and decided I wasn't healthy enough to be able to work in an office 40 to 60 hours a week. And so it wasn't the right fit for me anymore. And, that's really hard for somebody who's very career driven. And, I think there are a lot of people out there that have migraine and probably end up leaving the workforce or potentially getting fired for, being considered unreliable when in fact there's a disease behind this. And, with the ADA, we have people with invisible disabilities have rights, just like those with visible disabilities. So yeah, and it was heartbreaking for me to leave my career and wonder what I was going to do next. But thankfully, I ended up in a great place. I now work for a migraine advocacy nonprofit. I work from home, which means I have flexibility. If I'm having a bad day, I can lay down. I can go offline for a little while, and my employer knows I'm going to catch up and do my work when I feel better. And I think offering that flexibility to employees when it's possible can make a huge difference in retaining folks.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just self-awareness on both ends. Your former employer knowing like, okay, this is what we want, and Katie is not going to be able to meet that. And you saying, well, this is what I need, and this employer isn't going to meet that. So I think there's a lot of also, when you live with this disease, recognizing what you can and cannot do. So one thing that I've learned is I can't have a lot of meetings every day. It's just really difficult, draining. I mean, some days it hurts to wear clothes. So I've changed my work to project-based, and it's really changed everything. So what are the ways that you work best?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so many things. You mentioned the too many meetings. I have like a weird thing where speakerphone it always triggers for some reason. So I try to wear earbuds. Just like if somebody's talking to me in a car, I ask them to call me back. It's just some kind of background noise. I know that I have, my morning starts out rough, and then I usually kind of my mid-morning to, maybe 1 o'clock is my kind of sharpest time of day. And then I tend to decline in the afternoons again. So I schedule my meetings and my, key events kind of during that window when I know I'm most likely to be feeling well. Thankfully, I also, in working in the migraine advocacy space, I work with a lot of very understanding people. So if I am not able to join a call or be in a meeting, they're usually pretty understanding. Video, these days we live on Zoom in this virtual world, and sometimes the eye strain of being at the computer on these meetings can be too much. So just sometimes I shut off my camera when I'm in these Zoom meetings, or I just dial in and just rely on the voice. those types of accommodations. I try to take breaks and get outside for a short walk during the day. So I'm getting some fresh air and doing good self-care kind of on top of making sure I get my work done.
Mm-hmm. And I can completely relate. Every morning is 2 hours to get started. Because,
exactly.
I do yoga. I have to make sure I eat. And you're so aware when you're living with, something chronic of what makes you feel good and what you have to do to get that feeling the rest of the day or, part of the day.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So what advice would you have, to HR leaders who may kind of be on the fence about the remote, and hybrid structures we're having right now?
It's hard. It's hard on everybody, but I think that the more flexible employers can be with employees and creative around figuring out solutions, the more likely you're going to be to retain your talented workforce. Like I said earlier, I think people with migraine often there's a lot of stigma around the disease, and there's a lot of stigma around the person themselves, and they get coined as lazy and unreliable and, just not the type of person that somebody wants to work with. But if somebody takes the time to understand why this person is constantly calling out of work, and, you don't have to get deep into their medical history, but just understand that they're living with a serious disabling condition. There are things that employers can do, and there could be, even if they can't allow an employee to work remotely, perhaps, there's accommodations at work, like filters for screens, or, getting them out of the fluorescent lighting, or perhaps they need to be able to work in an office instead of a cubicle so that they have, a more controlled environment in terms of noise and light. The flexible schedules, again, as much as possible, can be really helpful. Sometimes people are going to be at their peak and able to work later in the evening. And that's, again, not to say that there are millions of people who live with migraine who function just fine in a regular 9-to-5 job in the office. And maybe, once a month or 3 times a year, they get an attack. But then there are also those of us like you and I who are chronic and live with this condition daily. And so some accommodations do need to be made and can help improve the productivity of those folks.
And I also want to talk about what a vulnerable thing it is for anyone living with a disability to come to HR. So it's a careful dance that we have to do.
It is.
How much information we let out. If we let out too much, will this be stigmatized? How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a question I feel like I get asked a lot, and when you're on the different forums online, a lot of people have this question, like, should I tell my employer that I have migraine? And for me, I went for several years without telling anybody that I worked with that I had migraine, and then I started getting interested in migraine advocacy, and it was, I think, through that process that I became more confident in my voice and my willingness to share. But before I had that, I really would consider who I was talking to and how much I trusted that person. And, thankfully I had a relationship with the HR folks in both of the last 2 companies I worked with, and felt comfortable speaking with them. I did have a situation where, when I was applying for a job at the last employer I worked for, I was going through a particularly bad time with my attacks, and my interview was scheduled, and I called the day before and said, I've just been having, I really hesitated, but I decided I needed to say something, because similar to you, one of the things that happens with these attacks is you lose your words, and it's hard to articulate properly. And I thought, if I go into an interview at a new company and I can't articulate what my skills are, and I'm in a ton of pain, I'm just not going to be properly representing myself. Yeah. And so I called and I asked if there was any way I could reschedule the interview, and because I was having migraine attacks, and I was nervous that they were going to, kind of put that on my record and mark that against me. But unfortunately, they said they couldn't reschedule. And I think that's due to a lack of understanding of the impact of this disease. But I went forward and I did the interview, and I did end up getting hired. And I just, I think you have to be, the person with migraine has to get to a point where you decide to trust trust yourself, trust your symptoms, trust how it's impacting you, and don't let the judgment from other people hold you back from kind of being your true self. And hopefully, at your workplace and HR professionals will meet you with compassion and be more likely to ask questions about what they can do to be helpful versus immediately kind of shutting you down or making you feel bad for what you're asking for.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like, one bad interaction can really sour an employee. And, for the people who listen to this podcast, for the guests that are on this show, I know that it breaks their hearts because they're so people oriented. But there's still that bad experience that, makes that person so scared. So I think an important thing to know for us, to communicate to HR leaders is, we do have that, that struggle. We do have past because I feel like every person living with migraine has some sort of instance, some sort of sentence said to them that has just crushed them, that, it's very difficult for them to recover. So, with HR leaders who really want to help and are people oriented, it's important for them to remember that, there is also trauma associated with the disease too.
Absolutely. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you have in the works with Miles for Migraine? Anything exciting coming up?
We're just wrapping up. We just had our last walk, run, relax event of the year this past Saturday in Miami. So we're in the process of wrapping up our 2022 year. One of my favorite things at the end of the year is that we can go back through all of the funds that we've raised, and we're able to issue grants to 24 different headache centers around the country to impact migraine research. So we're focused on that. We're focused on planning for the next year. And, I have another role that I play. I volunteer with another advocacy group called the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy. And they have an annual advocacy event I mentioned earlier called Headache on the Hill in DC. Mm-hmm. And so we're preparing for that in February. That's when we go speak to members of Congress about the need to modify federal policy to, better address the needs of people living with migraine and headache disease. And one of the issues that we've been really focused on the last several years has actually been the whole Social Security disability evaluation process, and how that works for folks with invisible disabilities, and that there's a lot of discrimination that takes place there, and trying to address some of those issues. Mm-hmm. So lots on the plate, hopefully making a difference and carrying on.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, are there any final words that you would like to leave these awesome HR leaders with?
I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. I think, I would just like to leave you with the fact that migraine is not a bad headache. It's so much more and impacts people in so many ways. And with the prevalence of migraine in our country, 47 million people living with migraine, you have employees living with this, and the more that you can do to have programs and show acceptance to them, the stronger your workforce is going to be.
Definitely. So what's the best way to reach you or learn more about the organization?
Yeah, Miles for Migraine. You can find us online. We're on social media too. It's Miles for Migraine, no S on the end. My email is katie@milesformigraine.org if you have any questions. And you can also check out the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy online through the web or Facebook, Twitter. We're in all of those places.
Thank you so much, Katie. It has been a great conversation, and I'm really excited to, have some of the HR leaders in this audience get a perspective on, what it's like and how they can really step up to the plate for people that are living with migraine.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I'm Lindsay Patton, host of People Analytics Podcast. If you know of anyone who would be a great guest on the show, feel free to reach out to me, lindsay@staffgeek.com. And thank you again, Katie.
Thank you for listening to Staff Geek's People Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Patton, and I'm always looking to interview leaders who put people first. If you or someone you know lead with a people-first mindset, please email me at lindsay@staffgeek.com. That's LINDSAY@staffgeek.com. If you want to take things a step deeper and understand your organization's true culture DNA, I encourage you to take Staff Geek's free culture assessment. Just head to staffgeek.com and click the button that says Free Culture Assessment. Thanks again for listening.